Hi, I'm John DeVore. Welcome to the channel. Today's not going to be a record review or anything like that. A couple of days ago, a musician came by here that I had met. Originally, we had contacted each other because I supported a Kickstarter campaign for a record he put out. He got in touch. He's a bit of an audiophile. And then I ran into him several months ago. Actually, we were both on our way back from the Munich high-end show. He's a French-born jazz saxophone player who now lives in New York City. And we connected and he asked if he could come over. He had the tracks recorded for two albums that needed to be, one of them needed to be mixed and mastered and the other one needed to be mastered. And these are two upcoming albums that he's going to be releasing in the next couple of years probably, or a year and a half. The artist is Jerome Sabbagh, and the record that I originally bought, that Kickstarter record, is this one here, No Filter. And it's a great record, great playing, but this is not, like I said, this is not a record review. And I had a great time listening to Jerome's new upcoming records. They're going to be amazing. They're going to be awesome. The first one I think that's going to come out is a quartet that he does with legendary pianist Kenny Barron. And then after that, he has a trio with another absolute legend, Al Foster, on the drums. Both of those are really killer. And one of the interesting things about, for me at least, about the evening that we played all of these tracks was that they were recorded in very different ways. The usual way that Jerome likes to record is a live to two-track format. Now, live to two-track essentially means the musicians are playing and the result of that playing, so playing, recording is happening, and you end up with a two-track reel-to-reel tape. It doesn't have to be reel-to-reel tape, it could be digital, whatever, but you end up with two tracks recorded. It's a much trickier way to do a recording because everything essentially has to be mixed perfectly before the recording. So it all comes from the microphone feeds into the mixing console, and whatever you want to put on it, compressors or anything like that, it goes onto that tape, and that's it. It's on there. You can then master it, but you can't really do very much mixing because all of the levels of the individual instruments are sort of fixed at that point. And the Al Foster trio was recorded that way. The Kenny Barron quartet was actually recorded in the more common way in modern times in what's called multi-track. And so you have all the microphones on the instruments, they come in through the mixing board, and then they are all put down on individual tracks. Again, could be on tape, could be digital. In Jerome's case, it's all analog, all on tape. He does everything analog. All of his recordings are analog. And so then you end up with a recorded tape that has, in this case, 24 individual recorded tracks on there. And then that 24 track tape gets put back on a machine. Those 24 tracks are put back through the mixer. All the levels can then be adjusted. All of the mixing can then happen, meaning individual volume levels of each instrument or each mic feed, where you want all of those individual mic feeds in a sound stage, various compression, various EQs, all that kind of stuff can then be done in that process. And then that goes to a final two-track tape. So after that process, then he gets his two-track tape, which then could be mastered for production. So the multi-track system of recording generally has an additional step. Essentially, you've got to go through that mixing board process twice, whereas when you do live to two-track, you're only going through the mixing board and all of its electronics a single time to get to that two-track master recording. And you can actually do live to two-track in a couple of different ways as well. You can do the ultra purist way of doing a single stereo microphone or a stereo pair of microphones, one leading to one track, one leading to the other track, and that's it. Or, as is the case with Jerome, multi-mics, a couple of mics on the drums, a couple of mics on a piano, a mic or two on his saxophone, and then those are mixed very carefully, adjusted how they want them to be, and then those are then recorded on the two tracks. In either case, you've got the same number of steps leading to that two-track tape. And it was really fascinating to listen to the differences. I mean, of course, they were different studios, different engineers, different musicians. And it was fascinating to talk to him about what he's looking for, especially since he's got perspectives of a musician, of someone who is doing the recordings. He's a sort of a session leader, and he's kind of responsible for getting these recordings out there. Plus, he's an audiophile. So it was fascinating to get his take on what he wanted to end up with, and sort of comparing and contrasting that with a lot of other styles and methods. One of the things that he does like doing that live to 2-track recording. The Kenny Barron session, though, was done during COVID, and his normal engineer, the normal guy who does that 2-track recording for him, was not available, and that is a very specialized art, and so he had to do it, as I said, in that more conventional multi-track way. So what he brought here a couple of nights ago were the rough mixes of all of this stuff. So I got to hear the Kenny Barron sessions, and I got to hear the Al Foster sessions. And of course, I had his record of previous session, and I have him playing on a Nouvelle Records session, which again is recorded in a very different way, multi-track, but the mixing and overall presentation of everything was again very different. One of the things Jerome and I talked about was the end result in how things are placed in the soundstage. So essentially that's referring to the imaging of the stereo signal. Imaging, essentially, if you're not an audiophile, imaging is what you get when you sit in front of your 2 stereo speakers and they're set up properly and you're sitting in the right spot. You play good recordings through them, and the system should essentially paint a sonic picture for you of a soundscape in front of you that is not connected to the speakers. So you may have a solo vocalist who's singing right from the center. You may have a drummer that's sort of a little bit back and a little bit to the right. You might have a bass player a little bit to the left. You may have a guitar player. And all of these things are sort of placed in a sonic space, in a sort of a spacescape in front of you that the speakers are sort of magically painting. And all that stuff is essentially encoded on the recording by the engineers. And it can be done either naturally in the case of 2 stereo mics feeding 2 channels, or in the case of a binaural recording, which is essentially a dummy head with realistic sculpted ears and then little microphones inside the ears. And so that dummy head is essentially picking up what a human head would be hearing from that exact spot. And those work beautifully through speakers, but they work especially well through headphones. So that's sort of that's a natural way of getting your stereo information onto the 2 tracks. Or you can do it artificially, which is what we're sort of talking about here, where somebody is mixing the different elements of a recording onto those 2 tracks in particular ways. So panning left to right to adjust the position across the soundstage of different instruments. There's front to back adjustment can be made with tonality and ambience, sort of reverb or delay kinds of things. And even vertical height can be sort of encoded in these recordings as well. So it was really cool to talk to him about this kind of thing. So in the Kenny Barron record, the pianist, so there was a piano, bass, drums, and Jerome on saxophone. Kenny Barron was in the center of the soundstage. Saxophone was to the left in the soundstage. Bass was part of the way to the right, and drums were also in the right. And this was essentially how it was mixed. And to some extent, it was how the musicians were sort of in the room itself, to some extent. They all played live, they played at once, and so sitting here and sort of analyzing it a little bit, I could hear a little bit of snare drum coming from the microphone that was picking up Jerome's saxophone, things like that, which contributed to a little bit of a room sound to some extent. This was a rough mix. There was no effects at all anywhere on this. No reverb. Reverb was probably going to be added at some point. Probably a little bit to the horn. But from my experience of his other recordings, it doesn't seem like he likes to add a lot of that artificial ambience to these records. One of the other interesting things that we were talking about was, we're talking about stereo recordings, but then individually within this stereo landscape here that we're talking about, the individual instruments can also be either stereo or mono. Remember, there's multiple microphones involved. So if you have more than one microphone involved on one instrument, for example, drums or piano, you can actually then mix that instrument in a stereo soundstage in stereo, or you can mix it in mono. If you mix a drum set in a stereo image in mono, that means you pan all of the microphone feeds that you're going to use for the drums, whether it's 2 mics, 3 mics, however many you want for the sound that you're trying to get. You pan them all to the same place in that left to right spread. So 3/4 of the way to the right, for example, for the drums. You pan every mic to that same spot, and then you've got a mono drum kit in the stereo soundstage pinpointed to one spot. And that's the way Jerome Sabbagh likes to mix drums. And it's a little bit more of an old school way. It evokes a little bit of the Rudy Van Gelder style mix that he did for all of his legendary Blue Note records. Or you could record in a little bit more of a modern way. You could record the drums in stereo, meaning you take all the microphone feeds coming from the drum set that you want to use, snare, kick drum, maybe something up high to capture cymbal sound, tom-toms, whatever it is, however big the kit is, however many microphone channels you end up having, and then you actually mix them into a little miniature soundstage within the soundstage itself. So instead of pegging everything to 3/4 to the right, you put the snare drum at 3/4, you put the bass drum just below that, maybe you nudge the hi-hat a little bit to the right, you nudge the tom-toms a little bit to the left, so then you're actually painting a little bit more dimension into the drum set within that sonic picture. Same thing can be done for any sort of larger instrument. Piano is another great example. A piano keyboard already is this wide. The piano itself is a gigantic instrument that takes up a lot of physical and sonic space in any room that it's playing. The classic stereo setup, of course, with a piano you have right hand is the higher notes, left hand is the lower notes. So you have this ability, if you're mixing a stereo piano into a record, you have to decide which way you want the keyboard to face. Essentially, do you want the pianist to be behind the piano facing you, in which case you would want to mix the higher keys, higher notes over towards the left, or do you want the keyboard to be facing you and essentially have the pianist facing away from you so that you get a little bit of a pianist's eye view, so that the left hand is on the left side, right hand is on the right side. I remember once one of the records that I was on, after we had recorded a bunch of tracks, we all went into the control room and he was starting to do a little bit of a rough mix, and he just sort of rapid fire did a rough mix of the drum microphones, and he had it set up from the drummer eye view. So it would have been as though the listener was sitting behind the drum kit and the hi-hat was over here on the left and the toms were over on the right. And I was just like, you got to flip that around. That to me made no sense whatsoever, because as far as I'm concerned, the sonic picture that I want that recording to paint is one from the audience perspective. So that means that I'm sitting behind the kit, not the audience. The audience is sitting on the other side of the kit, and therefore the left and right needs to be in that direction. With piano, it can be a little bit different, because sometimes the piano is arranged in different ways on the sound stage or on the stage, on the performance stage, in the recording studio, what have you. It was a really fun night, and the next day it really got me thinking about one of the classic audiophile arguments. And generally speaking, audiophile arguments are complete jokes. Digital is better than analog. Analog is better than digital. Tubes are better than solid state. Oh my God, tubes are so distorted. Solid state's better. Generally speaking, they're utter bullshit. And in my opinion, this one sort of is too, and yet it exists. And the argument, I don't know if you could explain it exactly as an argument, but there's an audiophile platitude, let's just call it that. And this platitude is stereo imaging is fake. Stereo imaging is a byproduct of the recording process, and it doesn't exist. Or stereo imaging is an artifact of the recording process. It's accidental. It's a sort of a byproduct. It doesn't exist in real life. There are so many ways to go after this platitude. The first way, the most obvious way to me, is the fact that stereo recording was invented, unless you're cynical and you think that the only reason that stereo recording was invented was to sell twice as many speakers as a mono system has. But assuming you're not that cynical, stereo recording in the 1950s was literally invented to reproduce a stereo image. It was literally invented. Stereo comes from the Greek root solid, in order to present a more solid, more three-dimensional, more realistic soundstage with imaging of instruments within that soundstage. The idea that it's just a byproduct of that is nonsensical. It's like saying that cars are really cool, they get you from point A to point B, and a byproduct of that process is that you don't have to walk. It doesn't make any sense, because cars were invented in order so that you didn't have to walk from point A to point B. Stereo high fidelity exists to reproduce stereo imaging. It's not a byproduct, it is the main product. The other argument that stereo imaging doesn't exist in real life is also patently absurd. If it didn't exist in real life, it wouldn't work. Stereo works because we have two ears. Stereo works because humans and mammals in general, most mammals, have evolved a hearing system, an auditory system that allows them to locate objects in space based on sound. If we didn't have that ability built in, evolutionarily built into our physical selves, stereo hi-fi wouldn't work. So this idea that stereo imaging doesn't exist in real life is really just absurd. Stereo imaging exists in real life. You hear a sound behind you, you turn your head to see what it is. How do you know it's behind you? Because we know where things are in space simply by hearing them. So some people say, well, in the concert hall, you don't get imaging. That's not true either. So the usual example that is given is you're in a big symphony hall and the orchestra is playing and the sound is just kind of everywhere. Well, I mean, it's true. You're hearing the sound of everything. You're hearing the sound of the instruments. You're hearing the sound of the instruments coming out from the orchestra on the stage and reflecting all around in the concert hall. Different concert halls have very different sounds. Some of them are awful. Some of them are incredible. Most of them are somewhere in between there. Concert halls also sound very different depending on where you're sitting in that hall. And even instruments themselves sound very different depending on what kind of room they're played in, how far away you are from that instrument, and even where you are in line with that instrument. For example, a violin. You play a violin, and the sound is not just coming out in an omnidirectional sphere exactly the same in all directions, not by a long shot. Violins project their sound, project the most powerful mid-range and upper mid-range and high frequencies straight out from the bridge and from the strings. Which is why first violinists tend to be arrayed on the left side of the stage, facing this way, with their violins tending to project out into the audience. That is so that the audience is able to hear the most articulated violin sound from the first violin section. Cellos and upright basses tend to be on the right because it's less important for you to hear the brighter, more direct and more dramatic upper frequencies beaming right off the strings because these instruments are dealing with lower frequencies. They're more resonant bodies, and they're broadcasting their information a bit more evenly throughout. So where you're sitting in the hall makes a big difference as well. If you're sitting in the back row of Carnegie Hall, I don't care how good Carnegie Hall sounds, you're hearing almost entirely reverberant sound. Technically, you are hearing imaging in that you hear sounds being reflected from everywhere, and your aural systems are actually painting a picture of the reflection points and of the structure of the room that you're sitting in. Whether that can be really called imaging, I'm not sure. But if you're sitting midway up on the orchestra floor, you are going to be getting some imaging. You're guaranteed to be getting horns from where they're coming from with some bloom of reverberation. You're definitely going to be hearing violin from there. If there's a soloist, if there's a violin soloist standing, you'll hear that soloist from a slightly different spot. If you sit where I often sit in Carnegie, I like to get seats up in a box very close to stage and very far to the right side of the hall, so that I'm looking down almost in line with the conductor on the opposite side of the hall from the violins. So I'm actually getting quite a bit of imaging. I definitely hear violins. I hear the different violin parts coming from slightly different areas. I'll hear woodwinds. I'll hear percussion coming from the back. I'll hear the bass coming from essentially under me, rumbling up. And there's absolutely imaging happening there. You can hear the different instruments in different spots. Another argument people make is that when you're listening to a rock band, you're just listening to the PA. Well, it's true. Let's say you're listening to Roger Waters and you're in a huge arena. Roger Waters tends to demand really good sound. He has a really good sound system and really good engineers. But you are essentially listening to his PA system. You're not hearing anything coming directly from Roger Waters' mouth or from his bass. You're hearing it come through enormous speaker arrays in the center, and these huge arrays left and right. Generally speaking, his voice is going to be coming from the center, and then the left and right are actually going to be mixed in some sort of a stereo mix in order to place images in front of you in different areas on that stage. If you're listening in a really small club, you may actually be hearing the PA only for the vocals. You may actually be hearing electric guitar through that electric guitar amp. You may be hearing the bass through the bass amp, and you may be hearing the live drums with no microphones at all. Back in the East Village when I was playing in the 90s, we played tons of shows that were like that, where the only thing that the PA is used for is a vocalist or possibly a keyboard player. And so in a situation like that, you're definitely hearing imaging. You're not going to hear the guitar coming directly from an electric guitar because the sound is not emanating from a Fender Stratocaster. The sound, when you play a Strat through a Princeton Reverb amplifier, the sound is coming from the speaker on that Princeton Reverb. So in a little club, in a little venue, you absolutely are hearing that guitar coming from that amp. You're definitely hearing that bass coming from his bass cabinet. You're hearing the drums and the cymbals and everything like that coming from the drummer, and you're hearing a singer coming from wherever the PA is, whether it's a single speaker, whether it's a pair mounted up high in the rafters, whatever it is. That's still imaging. And in the purest sense, if you're listening to chamber music, you're listening to a string trio in a small room like it was intended, unamplified instruments in a room that's not a glass box, you will definitely you'll hear beautiful imaging. You'll hear the violinist, you'll hear the cellist, you'll hear the pianist. They'll be coming right from where they are visually, and you are experiencing imaging right there. So I guess that turned into a little bit of a rant. It didn't intend to be, but sometimes audiophile bullshit balloons need to be popped. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye.